They told us surrender was mercy. They lied. I remember the final broadcast before Earth's skies went dark. It wasn't a speech or an anthem. It was a scream. A mother scream, broadcast accidentally through an open channel, before the orbital EMP silenced every satellite we had. I remember the hiss of static, the flicker of dead screens. I remember the hush that followed. That was the moment we all knew we had lost. The Drazari didn't negotiate. They descended. Towering things, seven-limbed exoskeletal horrors fused with living plasma armor, strode through our cities like gods. They weren't interested in domination. That would have required effort. No, they came to erase us like a virus scorch off a hard drive. In their eyes, we were not enemies. We were data corruption. I fought in the siege of Jakarta. Fought is generous. We bled, we burned, we screamed into scorched rubble. My unit, the 82nd Pacific, lasted 4 hours. By the 5th, I was the last one breathing, buried under the rubble of a collapsed transport rig. That's where I met Dr. Kasra Vayan, geneticist, survivalist, and the woman who would change everything. She pulled me out with a bone saw, a bottle of morphine, and a plan. "We can't win this," she said, her voice like steel dragged across concrete. "But we can make losing very expensive." Kasra had escaped with more than her life. She'd taken something from the Drazari databanks before their orbital cleanse. Something ancient. Something forbidden even by their standards. She called it Protocol Omega. They called it the Ashwake Plague. I didn't understand it back then. I was half dead, my lungs full of carbon ash. But in her bunker, beneath what used to be downtown Jakarta, she showed me things, biochemical blueprints, hybrid spore genomes, simulations of planetary death spirals. "We didn't lose Earth," she said. "We baited a trap." And like that, the seed of our counteroffensive was planted. Not a rebellion, not a resistance, a retribution. The few of us left, military ghosts, corporate saboteurs, hackers, fanatics, scientists, formed a last cabal of humanity, not to rebuild. That dream died with the ozone. No, we became something else. We became the apocalyptics. We stopped fighting for victory. We started fighting for cost. By the 3rd month of occupation, the Drazari had glassed 63% of Earth's surface. Cities fell. Oceans boiled. Our atmosphere began to thin. But something strange happened. Drazari commanders started dying. Not in battle. Not from weapons. They rotted from within. Their tech-melded bodies began rejecting themselves. Biometal turned brittle. Thought cores corrupted. Their ranks thinned, and no one could explain why. They didn't know we were feeding them death in the water. The Ashwake wasn't just a plague. It was an engineered apocalypse, coated with a Drazari-specific protein hook, hiding inside algae, waiting to bloom. Once airborne, it mutated every hour. It adapted faster than they could study it. And it was beautiful. That's when the Drazari committed their first mistake. They took a human alive. Me. They dragged me onto their ship like a trophy. Shackled. Half-starved. Eyes full of fire. I didn't resist. That's what made them nervous. I remember standing in front of their war mind, Kestlin. They called it 8 meters tall. A monument to ego and violence. Its voice was like thunder echoing through meat. "You are defeated." I smiled through bloody teeth. "No, we're just getting started." That's when the screams started. Not mine. Theirs. The Ashwake had reached orbit. I watched their command crew claw at their own armor. Skin sloughing like boiled wax. Data panels shorted. Drones spasm midair. The ship's internal biosystem began to eat itself. And me? I just stood there and laughed. "You should have let us die quietly," I whispered. They didn't realize Earth wasn't a battlefield. It was a bioweapon. You don't understand what vengeance is until you see it crawl. We didn't build fleets. We didn't raise armies. We whispered into the bloodstreams of our enemies. We infected their atmosphere, their water, their very shadows. And it all started with what we did next. After the Ashwake reached orbit, the Drazari panicked. They did what empires always do when they don't understand the fire they've lit. They overreacted. They turned their own ships against one another, cleansing entire squadrons to purify the infection. But the Ashwake wasn't just a sickness. It was an idea, a code weaved into bioform. It learned. It remembered. I learned it the hard way, aboard the crippled Drazari dreadnought, buried beneath layers of their dying metal. I was still their prisoner. Technically, but the ship had become a tomb, and I was the only one who hadn't rotted from the inside out. Castra's final gift to me, a subdermal immunity chain. She didn't just make me immune to Ashwake. She made me its host. I wandered through silent halls of Drazari tech fused with once-living tendrils, now pulsing, diseased, and dripping acidic waste. Their living machines were screaming in their own frequencies. The infection was rewriting the ship's AI, grafting itself into control nodes like cancer with purpose. I reached the central memory core. That's when the Ashwake spoke to me, not in words, in images, neural flashes. It had absorbed parts of the Drazari war mind's thought code. It showed me blueprints, coordinates, maps of their cradle worlds. One stood out, Viethun, the Drazari homeworld. We knew where they were born now. Castra always said, "You don't beat an empire in the field. You beat it in the womb." And I had the perfect seed. The apocalyptics weren't hiding anymore. Castra had gone dark after Jakarta, presumed dead, but I knew her better than that. She was the type of ghost that left fingerprints in every shattered lab we found. Her followers moved in shadows, spreading Ashwake in newer, smarter forms. One strain colonized dust. Another encoded itself in noise, piggybacking on Drazari intercoms, echoing through their networks as lethal whispers. I made contact through an ancient Cold War radio array buried in Antarctica, long dead to world, but still catching the right waves. A voice answered. Raspy, dry, familiar. "Is it you? It's me?" Pause. Then, God help them. By month 6, the Drazari started abandoning Earth. Not all at once. No fanfare. Just silence. One day a sky full of warships. The next just clouds and ash. We let them leave. We wanted them to carry it back. You see, the Ashwake wasn't just a virus. It was a message. Humanity had learned something far more dangerous than interstellar travel. We learned how to weaponize extinction. And now, we were going to show them we could scale it. I spent 3 weeks aboard the drifting Drazari dreadnought, letting the Ashwake repair what it could, until the ship, now part virus, part ship, part me, moved on my command. We didn't call it a vessel anymore. We called it the Apostle. With what power remained, we punched a hole through slip space and followed the Drazari trail. We weren't chasing them. We were hunting. They say light doesn't reach Viethun, that their homeworld orbits a dying red star, cloaked in thick planetary shields and orbital prisons for undesirable species. They weren't prepared for the kind of prisoner I'd become. As we dropped out of slip, their sensors pinged me immediately. A human warship wasn't just unexpected. It was impossible. They scrambled fleets. They activated the solar lattice. They even tried to talk. Unknown entity. Identify. You are approaching sacred Drazari territory. You will be incinerated. I keyed, and the only thing I needed to say, this is Earth's last ambassador. Then I opened every viral chamber in the Apostle's hull. I watched as clouds of Ashwake rain down onto Viethun's upper orbit, spreading across their sky like ink in water. You ever watch a god drown? Their sun began to flicker, literally flicker, as Ashwake-saturated particles invaded their solar reflectors. One by one, the orbital colonies blinked out. I didn't need to land. The Ashwake would speak for me. Humanity didn't just lose the battle. We became the thing you summon when you make the mistake of winning against us. We were the disease you catch after you declared victory. And for the Drazari, victory had just become a death sentence. You'd think the apocalypse would end with fire, but this one began with a heartbeat. Viethun burned, not with fire, not with lasers, not with any tool of war we'd once used. No, this was subtler, crueler. The Ashwake didn't reduce their homeworld to rubble, it corrupted it. Spores in their rain, code in their clouds. It twisted their atmosphere into a breeding ground for extinction. I watched it unfold from the deck of the Apostle, now fused with Ashwake neural spores that pulsed like a second brain behind my eyes. I didn't pilot the ship anymore. We moved together. Like a thought, my name used to be Captain Elias Warrick. Now they call me the host. The Drazari didn't understand what we'd become, and that terrified them more than losing. They responded like all empires do when they feel control slipping. They purged their own. I intercepted internal transmissions, panicked, fractured, desperate. Commanders ordered the incineration of infected colonies. Families locked themselves in biostasis coffins, hoping the future might remember them. Their highest priests activated something called the Silencing Protocol, a planetary sterilization fail-safe meant for their worst-case scenario. They were activating it on themselves. That's when the unexpected happened. Some of them resisted, not the humans, the Drazari. It began in their outer spire colonies, regions filled with laborers, genetic throwaways, and the undercast the Empire pretended didn't exist. The Ashwake moved through them slower, and it changed. It didn't kill them. It spoke to them. Some of the infected began surviving its touch. Their minds burned for a day, then cleared. When they awoke, they weren't quite Drazari anymore. Not fully, not purely. They were something else. Something hybrid. And they called themselves a Remembered. I made contact. At first, they thought I was a demon, the bringer of death, the punisher of empires. And they weren't wrong. But the one who met me, her name was Zari, looked at me not with hatred, but awe. You gave us what the Empire never would, she said, her voice a whisper wrapped in a rasp. Freedom and memory. Turns out the Ashwake didn't just kill. It unlocked the genetic fail-safes the Drazari priest kings had engineered into their own people for centuries. Sleeper code to keep the lower caste docile, obedient, limited. We'd broken the dam, and something ancient was flowing out. The Remembered weren't allies. Not yet, but they weren't enemies either. They were witnesses to the downfall, to the truth, to the cost of conquest. I showed them what Earth had become, not as a warning, as a promise. The Drazari hadn't just taken our world. They'd made a monster in its grave. Back aboard the Apostle, the Ashwake evolved. It began building again. But not cities, not ships. It grew structures of thought. Living code towers across Vithun's surface. Some were spires of bone-laced crystal, pulsing with heat and memories. Others were towers of ash, constantly eroding, reshaping, as if remembering every fallen human. Castor once said, "The apocalypse isn't the end. It's what comes next that defines you." I think the Ashwake understood that better than we did. Then came the signal. From somewhere deep beneath Vithun's crust. Old. Repeating. Not Drazari. Not human. The Apostle decoded it slowly, like unearthing a fossil one word at a time. It read, "The first fire waits." The Remembered heard it too. They fell silent. Reverent. According to them, it was a myth, a pre-Empire relic buried by the Drazari founders when they first rose to power. Some believed it was a god. Others, a weapon. I knew what it really was. A warning. Because if Ashwake was apocalypse, whatever lay beneath Vithun was what comes after. I made my choice. I would go below. I would follow the signal. And if I died down there, so be it. Because this wasn't about survival anymore. This was about finishing the story. You never truly understand a species until you see what they choose to bury. The signal pulsed from the crust of Vithun like a heartbeat. Slow, relentless, ancient. The Apostle couldn't penetrate the bedrock with scans. It was laced with some kind of phase-shielded alloy, fused with dark matter nodes. This wasn't natural. It was constructed. The Remembered called it Kezelmar, or the fire that remembers, according to their oldest myths. Tales buried so deep they were encoded in lullabies. Kezelmar was a punishment, a vault built by the first Drazari dynast to contain something they couldn't destroy, a mind, a voice, a reminder, and now it was waking up. I descended through a fissure opened by orbital bombardment. What had once been a geological scar was now a doorway, wide enough to swallow a dreadnought. The descent took 3 hours. The further I went, the less I felt human. Light bent in strange directions. Gravity flickered like static. Time warped. My chronometer showed microseconds stretching into minutes. The Ashwake inside me pulsed erratically, as if nervous. Even the virus feared what was below. The vault walls weren't stone. They were layers of fused memory, literal neural matter woven into crystal matrices, recording everything that had ever happened here. Thoughts, screams, betrayals, births, deaths. History encoded in pain. And at the center of it all was a chamber impossibly vast. Inside floated a sphere, blacker than void, crackling with dormant energy. Around it, rows of massive thrones carved from fossilized bone, each bearing the twisted remains of beings that had once ruled entire systems. They weren't Drazari. They were older. The sphere spoke, not with sound, with presence. Images hit my mind like freight trains. Planets screaming, suns devoured by hunger, civilizations worshipping this thing. I saw a time before the Drazari, when the galaxy was ruled not by empires, but by keepers, beings who believed memory itself was sacred. The Drazari had slaughtered them, buried their truth, took their technology, twisted it, built an empire of war upon its corpse. And the sphere? It wasn't a weapon. It was a library, a last testament. It called itself Inheritor, and it asked me a question. Will you remember or will you burn? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I showed it Earth, what they had done to us, what we had become. I showed it the craters where cities once stood, the ash fields where children burned. I showed a humanity clawing out of annihilation, not to rebuild, but to haunt. And I showed it the Ashwake, the Inheritor pulse once, a vibration so deep I thought my bones would liquefy. Then it showed me something in return. A map, a star chart written in physics, thought, and time. It wasn't a location. It was a sequence, a process to awaken the rest of its kind. There were more, not vaults, witnesses, scattered across the galaxy, silent, waiting, each one holding the forgotten truths of species the Drazari had exterminated in their rise to power. The galaxy wasn't sleeping. It was hiding, but there was a price. To activate the sequence, something living had to bond with Inheritor. Permanently. It would consume my mind, overwrite my consciousness, turn me into a living relay of forgotten histories, a memory made flesh. I didn't hesitate. Castor always said, let history be the weapon they can't survive. I reached forward. The pain was infinite. It chewed through my identity like wildfire through dry grass. Every moment I had ever lived was ripped apart, analyzed, copied, fused into the ancient neural lattice. And yet, I remained. I was no longer Elias Warrick, but I was not gone. I was something more, the first witness. When I emerged from the vault, the remembered fell to their knees. The Ashwake pulsed in rhythm with the stars. And across the black void, the signal spread. Other vaults began to stir. The Drazari High Conclave received a final message as their last fleet tried to regroup. You tried to erase us. Now we're the archive, and we will not forget. We weren't just the apocalypse now. We were the reckoning of memory. And the galaxy was about to remember everything the Drazari had tried to bury. They used to say history is written by the victors. But what if history writes back? The first wave of vaults woke less than a week after I bonded with the Inheritor. It started with echoes, strange bursts of encrypted energy, flaring like ghost stars across forgotten systems. Then came the messages, bursts of pure memory, raw and unfiltered, pulsing into the minds of every sentient being within range. The Drazari called it the screaming. I called it justice. Each vault housed not weapons, but truth. Recordings of genocides buried, cultures erased, stars collapsed to hide mass extinction. The Drazari hadn't just been conquerors. They'd been executioners. Every planet they touched had bled into silence. Now, those silences were singing. I stood aboard the Apostle, no longer just as pilot, no longer fully human. The Inheritor's voice whispered behind my thoughts, guiding, connecting. I saw through satellite ghosts, heard across comets, felt emotion through nebulae. And what I felt most was rage. Not human rage. Cosmic. The remembered, Those Drazari castes once broken and brainwashed were organizing, not as rebels, not as freedom fighters, as witnesses. Zari led them now. Her body still bore the scars of Ashwake infection. Skin etched with fractal patterns, eyes glowing dim blue like drowned stars, but she stood taller than any warlord. "We do not seek conquest," she told the galaxy. "We seek testimony." The Drazari conclave fractured. Half of them still clung to the Empire's dying breath, deploying countersignals to suppress the awakening vaults, slaughtering remembered enclaves in orbital purges. But the other half, they begged for silence. Some destroyed themselves to avoid the shame. Others defected, seeking refuge with humans, yes, humans, carrying databanks filled with classified horrors. For every secret they surrendered, I opened another vault. By the third week, 19 had awakened. One showed the harvesting of a silicon-based race whose minds could sing in ultraviolet. Another revealed a world burned alive because a priest foresaw the Empire's fall. Each memory shattered another piece of Drazari myth, and the galaxy was watching. All across the spiral arms, species long silent began to stir. The Teliari, long thought extinct, revealed they'd been hiding in folded space, alive, angry, and listening. The Kevnari, once slaves of the Drazari, began building sky chariots again. Even the Vaskari, who had always played neutrality behind their diamond citadels, sent a single message across the stars. We will not shield tyrants from the truth. What began as apocalypse had become a reckoning. And it wasn't just political. It was spiritual. The Ashwake changed too. It no longer simply infected. Now it translated. It absorbed and mirrored language, culture, pain. A bio-digital archivist, binding memory to matter. It spread not to kill, but to preserve. Where it passed, forgotten dialects bloomed. Extinct songs whispered again. Extinguished prayers echoed in dying air. And yet, for all our rising momentum, one truth loomed ahead. The Drazari had one more weapon left. They called it the Sunken Flame. Rumors said it was built at the edge of galactic law, on a mobile station outside of mapped hyperspace lanes. A secret project designed not to win wars, but to erase civilizations. Utterly retroactively. Temporal collapse bombs. Chronoscour drones. Tech designed to fold a race out of history before it ever existed. They hadn't used it yet because they thought they'd already won. But now, in desperation, they might. And if they did, not just humanity, but our memory itself could vanish. Castro would have called it poetic. The ones who erased others now trying to erase the erasure. But I called it what it was, genocide perfected. We couldn't let that weapon deploy. So I gave the order no soldier had ever given before. We burned their history first. We chased them to the end of time. Literally. The Sunken Flame wasn't a weapon in the traditional sense. It was a temporal silo, drifting in a null zone between real space and what Castro once called the chronoscars, fractured pockets of ruined time where reality twisted like a broken clock. You didn't find it by coordinates. You found it by memory. And I remembered everything. The apostle bore the scars of our war, hull fused with Ashwake tendrils, memory towers rising from its decks like coral in bloom. It was no longer a ship. It was a mind made of steel, grief, and vengeance. The remembered followed in swarms of retrofitted Drazari skimmers, now fused with Ashwake lattices, flying not by tech alone but intent. Our fleet had no flag, no anthem, only one message, pulsing through subspace relays like a curse. If you erase us, we will haunt even your forgetting. When we reached the anomaly, it wasn't what I expected. The Sunken Flame wasn't vast. It was quiet, a smooth obsidian ring suspended in the void, half submerged in space-time distortion. Light bent away from it. Time bled around it. It looked small, like a door you couldn't unopen. Zari stood beside me, armored in ceremonial memory, plating carved from her own transformation. She looked at the flame and whispered, "Do you feel that?" I did. Regret. Old. Cold. And familiar. The Drazari weren't just afraid of us. They were afraid of what they'd built. We boarded through a spatial breach woven from temporal silence, something only the Ashwake could detect. Once inside, everything stopped. No sound, No breath, no heartbeat, only memory. Frozen mid-thought. There were Drazari here, hundreds, preserved like statues in glass, eyes wide in horror, some mid-sentence, others mid-scream, caught in their own weapon's recoil. Castra's words rang in my head. When you build something to erase time, you risk erasing yourself. At the core was the heart loom, the mechanism that anchored the sunken flame, a sphere of unstable time-fold energy, tethered to what I can only describe as a neuralized engine of intent. It didn't fire with a trigger. It fired with a thought, and it had already been primed. One more signal, one more mind willing to collapse a timeline, and humanity would be retroactively deleted, not just from history, from possibility. No ruins, no ash, no memory, just void. That's when he appeared. High Executor Varn Kether, last true architect of the flame. His armor bore imperial insignia half burned by Ashwake corrosion. One arm was a crude prosthetic. His face? A roadmap of hatred and fear. You've already lost, he said. Your war ends here. I stepped forward, memories blazing behind my eyes. No, it ends everywhere. He raised his hand toward the loom. The signal spike flashed red. Zari moved first, a blur of fractal motion, her blade of crystallized memory slicing through Kether's arm before his fingers could finish the neural trigger. He roared. I ran, straight into the loom. You cannot understand what time tastes like until it's crawling inside your skull. The loom pulled me into its core. I didn't fall. I fractured. I saw myself, young, dying in Jakarta. I saw myself, old, sitting beside Castra as she coded the first Ashwake string. I saw a version of myself that never fought, a version that surrendered, that wept, that watched humanity kneel. And then I saw a version of Earth that never rose again. The Drazari danced on our bones. That was the world they wanted back. I couldn't let it happen. I reached into the loom with my entire self, human and virus, memory and fire, and I rewrote the code, not to destroy it, to invert it. The loom pulsed. Once. Then again. Then it screamed, but not in destruction, in resonance. I gave it new coordinates. The Drazari homeworld, their bloodlines, their cradle of conquest. Let them feel what we felt. Let their past vanish. And then I sent a command. Execute, temporal mirror. Outside, the void twisted. Stars flickered in reverse. The Drazari timeline folded inward, not wiped, looped, locked in an eternal recursion of loss. They would remember what they did, forever, and they would never escape it. When the Apostle pulled us back from the edge, the sunken flame was gone. So was the Drazari Empire. But humanity? We remained, not just alive, witnessed. There's a silence that comes after war. Not peace, not healing, just silence. The kind that settles in your chest like dust on a ruined flag. The kind that echoes with the weight of everything you've burned to stay alive. The Drazari are gone. Not dead, not extinct, just unwritten, folded into a recursive echo of their own crimes, forced to relive their rise and fall for eternity, a temporal tomb no blade could cut and no fleet could breach. They called it erasure, but I called it mercy, because what we could have done, what we almost did, was worse. I returned to Earth, or what was left of it. The Apostle broke orbit silently, shedding its Ashwake growth like an old skin, folding itself into a cocoon of memory before entering final stasis in Earth's moon shadow. It had done what it was made to do. Now it, too, would rest. I stood where New Jakarta once rose. The craters were overgrown with wild, mutated flora. Trees sang in windless air. Ashwake spores had made peace with the soil. It wasn't a city anymore. It was a grave garden. And in the center, a monolith, etched in hundreds of languages, known and extinct. One phrase carved in the human tongue. We were here, and we remembered. The remembered began arriving within weeks, not as conquerors, as pilgrims. Zari had become more than a leader. She was a living reminder that even the worst systems can give rise to something new, something freer, something stronger. She stood beside me at the monolith, hands behind her back. "What happens now?" she asked. I looked to the stars, no longer hostile, no longer hunted. Now we decide who we want to be. Humanity had a choice. For the first time since the fires of our fall, we stood unshackled. No empire above us. No armada aimed at our skies. No chains of history dictating our future. We had the Ashwake. We had the vaults. We had the power to build a civilization not on dominion, but on remembrance. Kasra's dream, not to erase, not to conquer, but to record. So we did something no one expected. We didn't build an empire. We built an archive. We called the Orison Accord, a council not of rulers, but of witnesses, human remembered and species newly awakened by the truths we unearthed. Each member bore a single duty: preserve memory. All memory, even the ugly parts, especially the ugly parts. We sent envoys to the edges of the galaxy, some to vaults still buried, others to species long silenced. We offered nothing but one promise: you will not be forgotten. And in return, they told us their stories. We recorded them all, even the ones that made us weep. Some say we became the galaxy's conscience. Others say we became its curse. But we never again became its victims, because in a universe obsessed with power, we wielded the one thing no empire could ever take: truth. Now I am old. What remains of me is bone and memory, stretched thin across time. I live in the deepest chamber of the Orison Archive, what the younger historians call the Warwick Vault. They say I started the fire, but that's not true. The fire was already burning. I just made sure it remembered who lit the match. And so this is my final recording. To anyone who finds this, know that humanity lost a battle. We lost our cities, our skies, our children, but we found something greater. We found the power to make tyrants fear their own legacy. We became the story they couldn't delete. We brought the apocalypse. And in the ashes, we found ourselves,